Okay, here it is, my build, but more importantly, the story behind this build. The year is 1856. Many Mormons living in Europe had a desire to come to Utah to gather in Zion. Many of these Mormon converts were too poor to afford the trip. The Mormon leader Brigham Young devised the idea of using handcarts to make the trip to Utah more feasible. If handcarts could be used, there was no need to locate and purchase large, expensive wagons and the oxen or cows to pull these wagons. The Mormon handcart pioneers came from Europe and started arriving in the United States in 1856. Typically, the immigrants would sail into Boston, would then travel by train to Iowa City, where they would be outfitted with their supplies and handcarts. In 1856, there were a total of 5 handcart companies that made the trek west to Utah. These 5 companies ranged in size from 220 individuals to 576 individuals. The handcarts would carry each family's personal belongings. Oxen or cows pulled several large wagons that were assigned to each of the handcart companies. These larger wagons would carry extra food, large tents, and other supplies for the entire company's shared use. After receiving and outfitting their handcarts in Iowa City, Iowa, the immigrants traveled 275 miles to Florence, Nebraska, which is located on the west bank of the Missouri River, at the present-day city of Omaha, Nebraska. Final repairs and preparations were made at Florence before their incredible 1,030-mile trek to Salt Lake City, Utah. 3 of the 5 handcart companies departed Florence in late July. These immigrants had a few problems, but nothing out of the ordinary. They did have some deaths, but those were expected. They ended up reaching Utah 2 months or so later, just before the onset of winter. The 4th and 5th handcart companies of 1856 were called the Willie Handcart Company and the Mortensen Handcart Company. These 2 companies arrived late to the United States from Europe. They were also delayed in getting their handcarts and supplies. There was a lot of discussion as to when they should start their trek to Utah. Should they start now, risking running into cold winter weather, or should they wait till spring? The tragic decision was made to go ahead and begin the trek as soon as possible. The Willie Company, with 404 Mormons, started their trek on August 17th, and on the 27th, the Mortensen Company pulled out of Florence with 576 people. There was also the Hodgett Company with 163 people and the Hunt Company with 269 people. These 2 companies, the Hodgett and Hunt companies, were not handcart companies, but were wagon-driven companies that trailed behind the Mortensen Handcart Company. In early September, the 2 handcart companies, the Willie and Mortensen companies, were about 200 miles into their 1,000-mile-long journey. Around this time, the handcart companies were passed by fellow Mormons who were riding in fast-moving carriages being pulled by horses and mules. These men in their carriages arrived in Salt Lake on October 4th. These men reported to Mormon leader Brigham Young that the Willie and Mortensen companies had many delays, that these companies decided not to wait the winter out, and they were on the move heading to Utah. So the next morning, Brigham Young and other leaders spoke in church to their congregations about the impending plight of these handcart companies. Brigham Young asked for volunteers to gather together wagons and supplies and head east to rescue their fellow saints. A couple of days later, on October 7th, the first 27 men with their 16 rescue wagons loaded with food, clothing, and supplies departed Salt Lake City, each wagon being pulled by a team of 4 mules. Throughout the month of October, more rescue wagons were sent east. By the end of October, 250 wagons and a total of 362 men were sent east to assist in the rescue. While the rescue parties headed out on their long journey east, the Willie, Mortensen, Hodgett, and Hunt companies began to encounter the onset of an early winter. Cold winds and winter storms closed in on the pioneers. Now, at this point, I want to talk about the Willie Company and focus on them. They were a couple weeks ahead of the Mortensen Company and the other 2 companies. And I want to talk about their trials, and I want to talk about this diorama. Now, my diorama depicts a scene at the 6th crossing of the Sweetwater. The Willie Handcart Company probably crossed on the 19th of October, 1856. The snowstorm had begun earlier that day on the 19th. It was freezing and the winds were fierce. The winds are always fierce in Wyoming. Now, young Bodil Mortensen, who's sitting in the handcart, had just turned 10. She was traveling with the Nielsen family. The Nielsen family agreed to take Bodil to Utah to be with her sister, who had traveled to Utah the previous year. And Bodil's parents would come to Utah the following year. Bodil is sitting in the handcart with little 6-year-old Niels Nielsen, comforting him and keeping him as warm as possible with the blanket. In this scene, Bodil and Niels share a fleeting moment of solace. But Bodil must also be thinking, when will this end? Will this ever end? She also knows that when they cross, they must hop down off the cart, for all who can walk must walk. This scene also depicts Jens and Elsie Nielsen, the parents of little Niels. They are barefoot and working to get their handcart across the icy waters of the Sweetwater as quickly as possible. Once across, they will find a fire and dry and warm their feet up best as they can, then put on their boots, or at least put on whatever's left of their boots. Now that's the scene of this diorama, but their story continues. The Willie Company has crossed the Sweetwater, but are now out of food, and this after their rations had already been reduced multiple times. The company was now starving, and most have lost the strength or will to carry on any further. Many have died, and many are dying. On the 20th and the 21st, they are exhausted and cannot go on. But on this day of the 21st, the first of the rescue wagons arrived from Salt Lake. The much-needed provisions are the answered prayers to the destitute members of the Willie Company. 6 of the rescue wagons with a few men stay with the Willie Company. The rest of the rescue party moves east to locate the Martin, Hodgett, and Hunt companies. The Willie Company's rations are increased, their spirit is increased, and they prepare to push on again the following day. On the 22nd, the Willie Company moves up about 10 miles to the base of Rocky Ridge and prepare for the brutal 15-mile trek up Rocky Ridge. On the 23rd, the Willie Company pushes up Rocky Ridge through a foot of deep snow and cutting winds. Bodil, Niels, and other children trail behind the handcarts as they begin their 15-mile trek, including a 2-mile stretch that rises 700 feet in elevation. Bodil and Niels didn't get into camp until the wee hours of the morning of October 24th. Bodil went to fetch some firewood. Bodil was later found sitting against the wheel of a handcart, bits of sagebrush clutched in her hands. She froze to death in this position. Little Niels was also found frozen to death. 13 other members of the Willie Company perished on the 23rd and 24th from the march up Rocky Ridge. All were buried together in a circle pattern in a shallow grave at this Rock Creek site. Jens was heartbroken, and his feet were frostbitten. He must have broken his right foot. The injury to his foot caused it to be turned at a right angle for the rest of his life. Jens told his wife at the time, "Leave me by the trail in the snow to die, and you go ahead and try to keep up with the company and save your life." Elsie told Jens that she wasn't going to leave him, that he can ride, that she will pull the cart, and she did pull the cart for at least one more day. Jens, Elsie, and the rest of the Willie Company continued on to Fort Bridger. At Fort Bridger, their handcarts were left behind as more rescuers and wagons arrived to help them into Salt Lake. The Willie Handcart Company made it to Salt Lake Valley on November 9, 1856. Of the 404 members of the Willie Handcart Company that traveled in 1856, 68 died in their migration to Utah. And the Martin Company fared much worse than the Willie Company. Of the 576 members of the Martin Company that traveled to Utah that winter, 145 had died. And most all died from the effects of starvation and exposure, ague, and diarrhea. This was by far the largest tragedy in the history of the Oregon Trail. But think what would have happened if our pioneer heroes of Salt Lake City didn't answer the call and respond as quickly as they did. This is one of those events in history where great tragedy and great success were not exclusive to one another. And as for my connection to the Willie Company, not only was my great 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 grandfather Lot Smith listed as one of the rescuers, I just found out that the grandparents of Lot Smith's seventh wife, Diantha, were members of the Willie Handcart Company. Like Bodil, their names were Mortensen. Now, I do have one other connection to Bodil, Mortensen, and the Willie Company, and this one is the most important connection, but is also too long and complicated to fully explain here. But in short, around 30 years ago, as I made trips home from Utah to Colorado, I would get these incredibly strong, beyond the grave promptings from a little girl who needed me to find her. And it looks as though that I wasn't the only one she was calling to. Others heard her and found her and gave to her, along with the other souls of the Willie and Martin Handcart Company, what they had been waiting for 135 years to receive. And what was it that these members of the Willie and Martin Handcart Companies were waiting for? It was to have their temple work done. Their temple work was never done. Everyone simply assumed it was done. Now, temple work is very important and sacred to Mormons, and I believe, as others do, this oversight was revealed through spiritual means to church members living in Wyoming. And in 1991, they gathered together in the Ogden LDS Temple and took care of these ordinances in behalf of the members of the Willie and Martin Handcart Companies. And this temple work and the events leading up to it would be known now as the Second Rescue. This was just my short version. I would need to do another video to explain my longer, more complicated experience that ties into what I just talked about, with me having this sixth sense experience, if you will, regarding this little girl. And just to set the record for those who would doubt this story on the basis that I'm some religious zealot or something, yes, I am a Mormon. I like the Mormon Church, but I haven't been active in the church, and that's an understatement, for many, many, many years. So please don't draw any conclusions that I must be extreme in my religious beliefs without knowing a little bit about who I am. Okay, that's the story of my diorama build, but more importantly, it's the story of what drove me to create this artwork, if you will. And lastly, I love our pioneer heritage. The sacrifices they went through for what they believed in was incredible. No matter what anyone thinks of Mormons, I think all must agree that their history is rich and interesting, to say the least. I also love the fact that our Mormon ancestors believed in leaving us a record or accounts of their lives. These ancestral accounts are left with us in their journals, their remembrances, their interviews with LDS historians and news publications. All these records enable us to piece together their lives, relive their stories, and it gives us a realistic peek through the window of our ancestral past. So that's it. Thanks for listening. I do have just a little bit more about the diorama itself. When I was building my diorama, I felt a need to add into the scenery items that were actually from the Sweetwater River, where they had crossed. So Corey and I made a road trip up to Wyoming. We made a stop at the LDS Historical Handcart site. Then we went to the 6th Crossing Visitor Center. This visitor center is very close to where they actually crossed the Sweetwater River for the 6th time. This is the location of the scene in my diorama, and is where I gathered dirt from the banks of the Sweetwater River. When I got back home, I added the dirt, some of the dirt, to the bottom of the diorama, then poured my acrylic water over the top. There are also bits of small twigs that are used to depict some of the taller willows in the scene. And the other brush, the low-lying brush that you see on the banks of the river in this scene, are made from paintbrush bristles. And Corey and I also gathered bits of sagebrush. I used the sagebrush as the log you see in the river of the diorama. And to me, this sagebrush also represents the bits of sagebrush that were found clutched in the hands of Bodil when she was found frozen to death. So after the 6th Crossing Visitor Center, Corey and I traveled up to Rock Creek. Rock Creek is the memorial site where Bodil, Little Nils, and the others were buried. There's a large rock structure with a memorial plaque, and after we dug around a bit under the snow next to the large rock structure, we found the grave marker that lists the names of those who perished at this location. This marker included the names of Bodil Mortensen and Nils Nielsen. While there, I remember complaining to Corey about how cold it was. But we had no worries, no fears, for we knew the car was just right over there, engine running, with the heat turned up, and in about 5 hours and 300 miles later, we'd be sound asleep in a warm bed. And the reason I mention this is to kind of give us some perspective as to the life that they led and the sacrifices they made compared to the life that we lead today. Thanks for listening. Stephen Lott Smith.